The air in the Opelousas Parish Courthouse on that sweltering August morning of 1870 was thick, not merely with the oppressive humidity of a Louisiana summer, but with a palpable tension that clung to every soul present. Sweat beaded on foreheads, trickled down temples, and stained the starched collars of gentlemen and the simple cotton dresses of the women who packed the gallery. Every eye in the room, from the stern, faced Judge Thibodeau on his elevated bench to the lowest baff, was fixed upon a single fragile figure seated at the defense table. She was a young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, though her pallor and the almost ethereal quality of her stillness made her age difficult to discern. Her hair, the color of dried straw, was pulled back severely from a face that seemed carved from alabaster, devoid of expression, yet holding an unspoken depth that was profoundly unsettling. This was Elodie Fontino, and for nearly 3 decades she had not uttered a single word. The prosecutor, Mr. Davies, a man whose booming voice usually filled the room with an almost theatrical authority, now spoke in a hushed, almost reverent tone, as if afraid to startle a delicate bird. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, his gaze sweeping across the 12 men who held the fate of the esteemed Fontino family in their hands. "We stand here today not merely to prosecute a case of fraud and false imprisonment, but to uncover a truth buried beneath decades of silence. A silence, I might add, that was meticulously enforced by the very individuals now seated before you." He gestured towards the Fontino family. Ammon, the patriarch, his face a mask of aristocratic disdain. Odette, the matriarch, her eyes narrowed, her lips a thin, unyielding line, and Genevieve, their eldest daughter, whose beauty was now marred by a visible tremor in her hands. For 40 years, this family, pillars of our community, has maintained a grand deception. They have hidden a life, erased a soul from existence, all for reasons we shall soon expose. The defense attorney, Mr. Beaumont, a man known for his sharp wit and even sharper legal mind, rose slowly, his eyes never leaving Elodie. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he counted, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "My esteemed colleague speaks of deception and enforced silence. I speak of a tragedy, a profound personal sorrow that has afflicted the Fontino family for generations. My client, Miss Elodie Fontino, has been since childhood afflicted with a condition that renders her incapable of speech. To suggest her silence is a weapon, a tool of deceit, is not only cruel, but a gross misrepresentation of the facts. She is a victim, not an accomplice, and certainly not a witness capable of providing testimony." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, quickly silenced by a rap of Judge Thibodeau's gavel. The judge, a man whose tenure on the bench had seen countless dramas unfold, leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Mr. Beaumont, Mr. Davies, we are here to ascertain the truth. The court has heard the preliminary arguments. The prosecution intends to call Miss Elodie Fontino to the stand. The defense has argued her incapacity. However, given the extraordinary nature of the charges and the unique circumstances surrounding Miss Fontino, this court has ruled that she will be given the opportunity to speak should she be able. The question before us, therefore, is not if she will speak, but what she will say, and whether after a lifetime of enforced quiet, her voice can finally break through the wall of silence that has defined her existence." All eyes returned to Elodie. She sat motionless, her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the courtroom walls. The air crackled with anticipation. Would the girl who never spoke finally find her voice? And if she did, what secrets, what truths would spill forth from the depths of her long imprisoned soul? The very thought sent a shiver through the humid room, a chill that had nothing to do with the Louisiana heat. To understand the profound silence that enveloped Elodie one must first understand the world from which she emerged. Belrave, the Fontino plantation, a sprawling empire of sugarcane and cypress nestled deep within the bayou of St. Landry Parish. For generations, the Fontineos had been synonymous with wealth, influence, and an almost impenetrable aura of respectability. Their lineage traced back to the earliest French settlers. Their fortunes built on the fertile soil and the relentless labor of enslaved people, a legacy that even in the post-Reconstruction era continued to cast a long shadow over the region. Armand Fontino, the current patriarch, was a man of imposing stature and an even more imposing will. His word was law on Belle Rive, and his opinions carried significant weight in Opelousas and beyond. His wife, Odette, was the epitome of Southern grace and iron resolve, her delicate features belying a formidable intellect and an unyielding devotion to the family's standing. Their eldest daughter, Genevieve, was a vision of classic Southern beauty, poised to make an advantageous marriage that would further solidify the Fontino legacy. She moved through the grand halls of Belle Rive with an air of effortless superiority, her laughter echoing through rooms filled with antique furniture and priceless art. Yet beneath this veneer of perfection, a subtle discord had always lingered around the Fontino name. It was not a scandal, not an open accusation, but a persistent, almost imperceptible hum of unanswered questions, like the drone of cicadas on a summer night, always present, rarely acknowledged. Whispers fleeting as the mist over the bayou spoke of a certain aloofness, a guardedness that went beyond mere aristocratic reserve. The family was known for its privacy, its insular nature, but some said it bordered on secrecy. The charges now leveled against them, fraud and false imprisonment, had sent shockwaves through the community. How could such a family so outwardly impeccable be accused of such heinous acts? The initial legal filings were vague, hinting at a long-term scheme to conceal an individual, to manipulate records, to deny a person their very existence. But who and why? The very idea seemed preposterous. Yet the presence of Elodie Fontino in the courtroom, a woman whose existence was now undeniable, gave chilling credence to the accusations. Her silence, once dismissed as a personal tragedy, now loomed as the central enigma, the key to unlocking decades of hidden truths. The Fontineos, in their grand isolated world of Belle Rive, had cultivated an image of unblemished perfection. But the cracks were beginning to show, and the secrets buried beneath their polished facade threatened to erupt with the force of a summer's storm. The grand columned facade of Belle Rive, with its sweeping verandas and manicured gardens, presented an image of serene prosperity, but within its labyrinthine corridors away from the gaze of society, a different reality often unfolded. For decades the house had held a secret, a presence that was felt more than seen, a faint echo in the vast silence of the mansion. Servants, particularly the older ones who had spent their lives within its walls, spoke in hushed tones of the quiet one. Not a ghost, they would insist, but something almost as intangible, a fleeting shadow, glimpsed at the end of a long hallway, a soft, almost imperceptible sigh from behind a locked door, the faint scent of lavender in a wing of the house rarely used by the family. Celeste, an elderly housemaid whose hands were gnarled from years of polishing silver and scrubbing floors, remembered the early days. She had been a young woman when the Fontino children were born. First Genevieve, then a few years later another, but this second child, a girl, seemed to vanish almost as soon as she arrived. There were no christening parties, no public announcements, no proud displays in the town square. When Celeste, in her youthful innocence, once asked Mrs. Odette about the second baby, she was met with a stare so cold it froze the words in her throat. "There is only Genevieve, Celeste," Odette had said, her voice like chipped ice. "You must be mistaken. From that day forward, Celeste learned the unspoken rule. The second child did not exist. Yet evidence of her existence persisted, subtle as the morning dew. A small hand-stitched doll found tucked away in a forgotten corner of the attic. A child's drawing crudely depicting a grand house and a solitary figure discovered by a curious stable boy near the servants' quarters, only to be swiftly confiscated and burned by a watchful overseer. The family, particularly Odette, maintained an almost obsessive control over the household, ensuring that no servant stayed long enough to piece together the fragments, or that those who did were too intimidated to speak. Any questions, any hint of curiosity, was met with a chilling silence or a swift dismissal. "The Fontinos are a private family," our mom would declare, his voice brooking no argument. "And our affairs are our own." Distant relatives visiting from New Orleans or Baton Rouge occasionally remarked on the unusual quietness of Belle Reve, a house that, despite its size, often felt strangely empty. They might catch a glimpse of a pale face at an upstairs window quickly withdrawn, or hear a faint, tuneless humming from a secluded part of the garden. When queried, Odette would simply smile, a tight, unrevealing expression, and attribute it to the solitude of country life or a nervous house guest. The whispers, however, never truly died. They merely retreated into the shadows, becoming part of the unspoken lore of Belle Reve, a chilling undercurrent beneath the placid surface of Fontino respectability. It was a secret so deeply ingrained, so meticulously guarded that it had become almost invisible. A truth hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone bold enough to truly look. Not the year brought with it the decennial census, a meticulous accounting of every soul residing within the United States. For most, it was a routine, if somewhat tedious, exercise. For Mr. Elias Finch, the federal census enumerator assigned to St. Landry Parish, it was a sacred duty. Finch was not a man of grand ambitions or soaring rhetoric. He was a man of ledgers, of precise figures, of an almost obsessive attention to detail. His spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose. He moved through the parish with a worn leather satchel, a quill pen, and an unwavering commitment to accuracy. He had a particular knack for spotting discrepancies, for noticing the subtle gaps in the fabric of official records. When he arrived at Belle Reve, he was met with the usual Fontino blend of polite hospitality and veiled impatience. Armand Fontino, seated in his study amidst towering bookshelves, provided the information with an air of weary condescension. Armand Fontino, head of household; Odette Fontino, wife; Genevieve Fontino, daughter. Finch dutifully recorded the names, ages, and occupations. But as he reviewed the previous census records for the Fontino family, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor of unease began to stir within him. He had a habit of cross-referencing, of tracing family lines through the decades, a personal quirk that often yielded fascinating insights into the demographic shifts of the parish. He pulled out the 1860 census. Armand, Odette, Genevieve, all present and accounted for. He went back further to 1850. Again, the same three names. But something nagged at him. He distinctly recalled a local legend, a fleeting mention in an old parish register of a second daughter, born to the Fontenots in the early 1840s. A birth record quickly followed by a death record. Perhaps he had seen such things before, infant mortality being a harsh reality of the era. Yet the memory persisted, a faint echo of a name, a date. He returned to his office in Opelousas, a small, dusty room filled with stacks of ledgers and the scent of old paper. For days he pored over parish birth and death records, church registers, even old newspaper announcements. He found no death record for a second Fontino daughter, no mention of her existence beyond that initial fleeting birth entry. The omission was glaring, a child born, yet never officially counted in any subsequent census. It was an anomaly that prickled at Finch's meticulous nature. He returned to Belle Reve, this time unannounced, seeking clarification. Armel Fontino met him on the ver, his face darkening at the unexpected visit. "Mr. Finch, to what do we owe this persistence?" he asked, his voice laced with thinly veiled irritation. Finch, though intimidated, held his ground. "Oh, mistaken. Fontaine, I am merely seeking to clarify a discrepancy in the census records. It appears there was a second daughter born to your family in 1842. She does not appear in any subsequent census. Could you perhaps shed some light on this?" Armand's face went rigid. Odette, who had appeared silently behind him, placed a hand on his arm, her eyes fixed on Finch with an intensity that made him distinctly uncomfortable. "Mr. Finch," Odette said, her voice deceptively soft. "You are mistaken. There was a stillbirth, a tragedy we prefer not to speak of. The child was never named, never truly lived. It was a sorrowful time." Finch, however, had seen enough stillbirth records to know they were usually noted, however briefly. And the birth record he'd found had a name, Elodie. The explanation felt rehearsed, too smooth, too convenient. The air grew heavy with unspoken words, with the weight of a secret that had been carefully guarded for decades. Finch left Reve that day with more questions than answers, but with a conviction that he had stumbled upon something far more significant than a mere clerical error. The silence of the Fontenot, once a sign of their privacy, now felt like a deliberate concealment, a wall built around a truth they desperately wished to keep buried. Elod's world was a gilded cage, a series of interconnected rooms on the secluded west wing of Belle Reve. From the moment of her birth, deemed unsuitable for public display due to a subtle yet persistent tremor in her limbs and an unsettling quietness that defied all attempts at coaxing sound. She had been sequestered. Her mother, Odette, had made the decision with chilling pragmatism. A child who could not speak, who moved with an awkward grace, would be a stain on the Fontenot name, a weakness in their carefully constructed edifice of perfection. And so Elodie became a ghost in her own home, a living secret. Her days unfolded in a monotonous rhythm, marked by the shifting patterns of sunlight through tall arched windows that overlooked a neglected corner of the garden. Her primary companion was an elderly taciturn woman named Madame Dubois, a distant relative of Odette's, whose loyalty was bought with a generous stipend, and whose silence was guaranteed by a lifetime of servitude. Madame Dubois was not unkind, but she was unyielding. She ensured Elodie was fed, clothed, and bathed, but offered little in the way of warmth or conversation. Her instructions were clear. Elodie was to remain unseen, unheard, her existence a carefully guarded secret. Books were her only solace, smuggled in by a sympathetic young housemaid named Let, who would occasionally leave them on a table during her brief supervised visits. Elodie devoured them, losing herself in tales of faraway lands, of brave heroes and eloquent heroines, worlds vastly different from her own silent prison. The rooms themselves were furnished with a faded elegance, remnants of a bygone era, as if the Fontenayers had simply moved old pieces into the secret wing to avoid drawing attention. A grand four-poster bed, a heavy mahogany armchair, a writing desk where Elodie would spend hours meticulously copying passages from her books, her handwriting a testament to her quiet discipline. The only sounds that regularly penetrated her solitude were the distant calls of birds, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the faint, almost imperceptible hum of life from the main house. Laughter, music, the clatter of dishes, sounds that served as a constant, painful reminder of the world from which she was excluded. She would press her ear to the thick oak door, trying to decipher the muffled conversations, piecing together fragments of family life, of Genevieve's debutant balls, of Armand's business dealings, of Odette's social triumphs. Her confinement was not physically brutal, but it was psychologically devastating. The lack of human interaction, the constant reinforcement of her unsuitability, the crushing weight of her own silence, had shaped her into the ethereal figure now seated in the courtroom. She learned to observe, to read faces, to understand unspoken cues, for these were her only means of communication. Her mind, however, remained sharp, a repository of observations, of imagined conversations, of a lifetime of unheard thoughts. The world outside her windows, the vibrant, teeming life of Louisiana, remained a tantalizing, forbidden dream. She saw the changing seasons, the blossoming of magnolia, the fiery sunsets over the bayou, all through the filter of a pane of glass. A silent witness to a world she was never meant to join. This was Elod's world, a testament to the Fontenot's chilling determination to preserve their image, no matter the cost to a human soul. Edius Finch, the meticulous census enumerator, found himself transformed into an unlikely detective. The Fontenot's evasiveness, coupled with the glaring omission in the records, had ignited a spark of righteous indignation within him. He knew with a certainty that transcended mere paperwork, that a grave injustice had been committed, but proving it against a family as powerful and insulated as the Fontenot's was a monumental task. He began his investigation quietly, methodically, like a bayou alligator stalking its prey, unseen but relentlessly persistent. His first step was to revisit the parish archives, delving deeper into the birth records of the early 1840s. He found the entry Elodie Fontenot, born April 12, 1842 to Arand and Odette Fontenot. No death record, no baptismal record in the local church, which was highly unusual for a family of their standing. He then began to interview former servants, those who had left Bellerive over the years, often under less than amicable circumstances. He found them scattered across the parish, some working on other plantations, others in Opelousas, their memories faded, but their fear of the Fontenot's still palpable. He spoke to old Antoine, a former stable hand, whose eyes darted in nervously as he recounted seeing a little shadow flitting across an upstairs window in the west wing, a part of the house he was strictly forbidden to approach. They said it was nothing. "Monsieur Finch," Antoine whispered, his voice raspy. "Just the wind. But the wind don't wear a little dress." Lisette, the young housemaid who had once smuggled books to Elod, was now a rest in Opelousas, her youthful spirit dimmed by years of hard labor. She initially denied everything, her hands trembling as she pressed clothes. But Finch, with a gentle persistence, spoke of justice, of a life denied. He showed her the birth record, the name Elod, a flicker of recognition, then a flood of tears. She was so quiet, Monsieur. Let sobbed, never a sound, but her eyes spoke volumes. They were so sad. Lisette recounted her brief, clandestine interactions, the books she left, the silent gratitude in Elod's gaze. She spoke of Madame Dubois, the stern guardian, and the absolute prohibition against speaking of the other one. The resistance Finch faced was immense. Local merchants indebted to the Fontenot's feigned ignorance. Neighbors fearful of social ostracization offered vague platitudes about the family's privacy. But Finch was undeterred. He began to compile a dossier, a collection of these fragmented testimonies, these whispered observations, these official omissions. He noted the unusual expenses in the font ledgers for a special attendant and medical supplies that didn't seem to correspond to any known illness within the main family. He even found an old architect's drawing of Bellerive, showing a blocked-off passage leading to the west wing, a structural alteration designed to further isolate that section of the house. The evidence was circumstantial, a mosaic of whispers and shadows, but it painted a chilling picture. It suggested not a tragedy, but a deliberate, calculated act of concealment. Finch presented his findings to the parish attorney, Mr. Davies, a man known for his ambition and his willingness to challenge established powers. Davies, initially skeptical, was slowly convinced by Finch's meticulous work. The legal implications were staggering. False imprisonment, potentially fraud related to inheritance, and a profound violation of human rights. The decision was made to pursue charges to force the Fontenot to account for the missing life. The grand jury indictment sent shock waves through Satine. Landry Parish, shattering the Fontenot's carefully cultivated image and dragging their darkest secret into the harsh light of public scrutiny. The stage was set for a trial that would expose not just a family's deception, but the very nature of silence itself. The courtroom, now accustomed to the oppressive heat and the weight of expectation, became a stage for a slow, agonizing unveiling. Mr. Davies, the prosecutor, called a parade of witnesses, each one adding a small, often reluctant piece to the puzzle of Elod's existence. Old Antoine, the former stable hand, shuffled to the stand, his eyes wide with fear as he recounted the little shadow and the stern warnings from Mr. Fontenot. His testimony, though hesitant, painted a picture of a house with a forbidden zone, a place where a child might exist, unseen. Lettheris spoke with more conviction, her voice trembling but clear. She described Elod's pale face, her expressive eyes, the silent exchange of books. She was a person, monsieur, Let insisted, tears welling, a real person trapped inside that house. She detailed the strict rules, the constant surveillance by Madame Dubois, the fear that permeated the West Wing. Her testimony was the first direct confirmation of Elod's living presence within Belle Rêve, shattering the Fontenots' claim of a stillbirth. The defense, led by Mr. Beaumont, fought back fiercely. He cross-examined the witnesses, attempting to discredit their memories, to paint them as disgruntled former employees seeking revenge, or as simple folk prone to superstition and gossip. "You say you saw a shadow, Mr. Antoine Beaumont pressed, his voice dripping with skepticism. Could it not have been a curtain blowing in the wind, or perhaps a trick of the light in a house as old and grand as Belle Rêve? Antoine, flustered, could only stammer. It was more than that, monsieur. When the Fontenot family members were called, they presented a united, unyielding front. Armand Fontenot, his voice resonant with authority, denied everything. There was no other child, Mr. Davies, only Genevieve. My wife suffered a great loss, a stillbirth, which we chose to grieve privately. These accusations are a malicious fabrication, an assault on our family's honor." Odette, composed and elegant, echoed her husband's sentiments, her eyes betraying no emotion. "The servants are mistaken, Mr. Davies. They are prone to flights of fancy. There was no Elodie." Genevieve, though visibly distressed, maintained the family line, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have only ever had one sister, and that is not her." The contradictions were stark. On one side, the fragmented, fearful testimonies of those who had glimpsed the truth. On the other, the unwavering, powerful denials of the Fontenots. The jury, a mix of planters, merchants, and farmers, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, caught between the weight of the Fontenot name and the growing unease planted by Finch's meticulous evidence, and the servants' hesitant words. All the while, Elodie sat at the defense table, a silent, enigmatic presence. Her gaze remained distant, her face unreadable. The prosecutor, Mr. Davies, would occasionally glance at her, a silent plea in his eyes, urging her to break her decades-long silence. But Elodie remained a statue, a living testament to the profound mystery at the heart of the trial. The fragments of truth were swirling, but the complete picture remained elusive, locked behind a wall of silence that seemed impenetrable. The courtroom had reached a fever pitch of anticipation. Days had turned into weeks, filled with the droning of legal arguments, the hesitant whispers of witnesses, and the unyielding denials of the Fontinos. Yet the central figure, Elodie, remained a silent enigma. Mr. Davies, in a desperate last-ditch effort, called her to the stand. The bailiff's voice, Miss Elodie Fontenot, to the stand, echoed with a strange solemnity. She rose, a wisp of a woman, and slowly, deliberately walked towards the witness box. Every eye followed her, every breath held. She sat down, her hands still clasped, her gaze still distant. Davies approached her gently, his voice soft, almost paternal. "Miss Fontenot," he began, "can you tell us your name?" Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to press down on everyone. He tried again. "Miss Fontenot, do you understand where you are? Do you understand why you are here?" Still nothing. Armand and Noite exchanged triumphant glances. Beaumont, the defense attorney, looked on with a mixture of pity and professional satisfaction. This was it, the final confirmation of her incapacity. Davies, however, had one more card to play. He turned to the evidence table and picked up a small worn book. It was a copy of Jane Eyre. Its pages dog-eared, its cover faded. Letty had identified it as one of the books she had secretly given to Elod. He held it up. "Miss Fontenot," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "do you recognize this book?" Elod's head for the first time turned, her eyes, which had seemed so vacant, now focused on the book. A flicker of something akin to recognition, or perhaps longing passing through them. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Davies pressed on, his voice gaining a quiet intensity. "This book, Miss Fontenot, tells the story of a young woman who, despite great hardship and isolation, found her voice. She found her strength. She found her truth. Do you remember reading about Jane, Miss Fontenot? Do you remember her courage?" He placed the book gently on the railing of the witness box, directly in front of her. Eld's gaze dropped to the book. Her fingers almost imperceptibly twitched. A profound stillness descended upon the courtroom, deeper than any silence before. Then a sound, a faint, almost inaudible rasp, like dry leaves skittering across stone. It was a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the air. Everyone leaned forward, straining to hear. Elod's lips, which had been sealed for so long, parted. A single word, hoarse and fragile, emerged. "Jane." It was barely a whisper, but it was a word. A word spoken. A wave of shock, then a ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Odette gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Armand's face went ashen. Genevieve stared, her eyes wide with disbelief. Davies, his own eyes glistening, knelt beside the witness box. "Yes, Miss Fontenot, Jane." "What about Jane?" Elod's gaze lifted from the book, meeting Davis's eyes, then sweeping across the courtroom, lingering for a moment on her family. A flicker of something unreadable in her depths. Then slowly, painfully, words began to emerge. Not a coherent narrative, but fragments like shards of a broken mirror. "Alone, always alone. The window, the garden," they said. Not real, not allowed. Each word was a struggle, a testament to decades of disuse. Yet each carried the weight of a lifetime of unspoken pain. The courtroom was utterly silent, captivated by the raw, unvarnished truth spilling from the lips of the girl who never spoke. The wall of silence had finally shattered, and the echoes of Elod's voice promised to bring down the entire edifice of the Fontenot family's deception. Elod's initial fragmented words were just the beginning. Over the next harrowing days, with the patient guidance of Mr. Davies and the assistance of a kind elderly woman who had experience with traumatized individuals, Elod's testimony slowly began to coalesce into a coherent, albeit painful narrative. Her voice, though still weak and often, gained strength with each spoken truth, each memory unearthed from the depths of her long imprisoned mind. The courtroom listened spellbound as the full chilling extent of the Fontenot family's deception was laid bare. The reason for her confinement, Elodie explained, was not a stillbirth, as her parents had claimed, but a perceived imperfection. From birth, she exhibited a slight involuntary tremor in her hands and a profound, almost catatonic silence. In the rigid social hierarchy of 1840s Louisiana, where appearances were paramount, a child with such characteristics was deemed a potential embarrassment, a blemish on the Fontino name. Odette, driven by an obsessive desire to maintain the family's flawless reputation and secure Genevieve's future, made the ruthless decision to hide Elodie. Armand, though initially hesitant, eventually acquiesced, his pride and ambition overriding any paternal affection. Elodie was to be erased from public life, her existence denied, her very humanity stripped away. She described her daily life in the West Wing, the solitude, the endless hours spent gazing out the window at the forbidden world, the books that became her only friends. She spoke of Madame Dubois, her stern guardian, who enforced the rules with an unyielding hand, yet occasionally in moments of weakness, would read to her from the very books Lisette provided. Elodie recounted the rare, fleeting glimpses of her sister Genevieve, who would sometimes pass by her window, oblivious to the silent, watchful eyes behind the glass. She spoke of the profound loneliness, the constant ache for human connection, the desperate desire to speak, to be heard, to simply exist in the eyes of another. The most damning revelation came when Elodie, with a newfound clarity, described a conversation she had overheard years ago, pressed against the thick door of her room. It was between Armand and Odette, discussing the family's will. Elodie's existence, though hidden, complicated the inheritance, particularly a specific trust established by a distant, eccentric aunt, who had stipulated that her fortune be divided equally among all living Fontino children. By denying Elodie's existence, Armand and Odette stood to inherit a significantly larger portion, consolidating their wealth and ensuring Genevieve's opulent future. The imperfection was merely a convenient excuse. The true motive, Elodie's testimony revealed, was cold, calculated greed. The courtroom was a tableau of raw emotion, gasps of horror, murmurs of outrage, and the quiet sobs of those moved by Elodie's harrowing tale filled the air. Armand Fontino sat rigid, his face a mask of fury and disbelief, his aristocratic composure finally cracking. Odette, for the first time, seemed to shrink, her formidable presence diminished by the weight of her daughter's words. Genevieve wept openly, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her, the realization of her sister's suffering and her own unwitting complicity washing over her with devastating force. Elder's voice, once a symbol of her imprisonment, had become the instrument of her liberation and the undeniable truth that would bring the powerful Fontino family to its knees. The final days of the trial were a maelstrom of legal maneuvering and emotional intensity. Mr. Davies, armed with Elodie's testimony, delivered a powerful closing argument that resonated through the packed courtroom. He painted a vivid picture of Elodie's decades of isolation, her silent suffering, and the calculated cruelty of her parents. This is not merely a case of a family's private sorrow, as the defense would have you believe. Davies thundered, his voice echoing with moral indignation. This is a case of a life stolen, a soul imprisoned, a human being denied her very identity, all for the sake of reputation and greed. Elodie Fontino was not a stillbirth. She was a living, breathing child, hidden away like a shameful secret. Her voice silenced by those who should have cherished her most. Her words, fragile as they may be, are the undeniable truth that demands justice. Mr. Beaumont, for the defense, made a valiant, if desperate, attempt to salvage the Fontino name. He argued that Elodie's testimony, given her long isolation and presumed mental fragility, was unreliable, perhaps even a fabrication influenced by the prosecution. He emphasized the Fontinos' standing in the community, their philanthropic endeavors, their impeccable reputation. "Consider the source, ladies and gentlemen," Beaumont pleaded, gesturing towards Elodie. "A woman who has lived in seclusion for decades, who has only just found her voice. Can we truly trust the fragmented memories of such an individual against the word of a family who has served this parish with honor for generations? This is a tragedy, yes, but not a crime. It is a family's desperate attempt to cope with a difficult situation, to protect a vulnerable child from a harsh world." The jury retired, their faces grim, the weight of their decision palpable. Hours stretched into a day, then into a second. The entire parish held its breath, divided between those who clung to the Fontinos' long-held respectability and those who were horrified by the revelations of Elod's testimony. Finally, on the third day, the jury returned. A hush fell over the courtroom, so profound that the buzzing of a fly could be heard. Judge Tibito, his face unreadable, called for the verdict. The foreman, a stoic farmer named Mr. Dubois, rose. His voice, though quiet, was clear. "On the charge of false imprisonment, we find the defendants Armand Fontino and Odette Fontino guilty." A collective gasp erupted, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Armand's face, which had been a mask of defiance, crumpled. Odette let out a small choked cry, her elegant facade finally shattering. Genevieve buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, on the charge of fraud related to inheritance. The foreman continued, "We find the defendants, Armand Fontino and Odette Fontino, guilty." The courtroom erupted in a cacophony of shouts, gasps, and murmurs. Judge Tibito struggled to restore order. Elodie, seated at the prosecution table, watched it all unfold. Her face still pale, but her eyes, for the first time, held a flicker of something akin to peace. The verdict was a seismic shock to the foundations of St. Landry Parish. A testament to the power of truth, however long suppressed, and the courage of a single long-silenced voice. Justice in its slow, grinding way had finally arrived, tearing down the walls of deception that had imprisoned Elod for a lifetime. No. The verdict sent shockwaves far beyond the confines of Opola's parish. The esteemed Fontenote name, once synonymous with power and prestige, was now irrevocably stained. Armand and Odette Fontino, pillars of the community, were sentenced to terms of imprisonment, their wealth significantly diminished by fines and legal costs, and their social standing utterly annihilated. Belrave, the grand plantation that had once been a symbol of their empire, now stood as a monument to their cruelty and deceit. Its fields, once meticulously cultivated, began to show signs of neglect, its grand halls echoing with the ghosts of a hidden past, rather than the laughter of a vibrant family. For Genevieve, the consequences were equally devastating, though different in nature. Her engagement to a prominent New Orleans gentleman was swiftly broken. Her social circle evaporated, and her future, once so bright and assured, became shrouded in uncertainty. The realization of her sister's suffering and her own unwitting role in maintaining the family's secret weighed heavily upon her. She retreated from society, haunted by the image of Elod's pale face and the fragile words that had shattered their world. The burden of her family's crimes and the profound moral questions they raised would follow her for the rest of her life. Elod's journey, however, was just beginning. The transition from decades of profound isolation to the bustling, cacophonous world outside Belrave was not easy. The sounds, the sights, the sheer volume of human interaction were overwhelming. She was placed in the care of a compassionate local family. The Dubois, no relation to Madame Dubois, who understood the delicate nature of her recovery. They provided her with a quiet, stable environment, allowing her to slowly acclimate to her newfound freedom. Her voice, though now present, remained soft and she often preferred to communicate through writing, a habit formed during her long years of solitude. She spent hours in the local library, devouring books, her mind eager to absorb all the knowledge she had been denied. The community's reaction was complex. There was widespread condemnation for the Fontinos, a sense of betrayal that such a respected family could harbor such a dark secret. But there was also immense pity and a burgeoning admiration for Elodie. Her story became a cautionary tale, whispered in parlors and discussed in hushed tones on street corners, a stark reminder that even the most polished facades could hide the deepest depravities. Elias Finch, the unassuming census enumerator, was hailed as a hero, his meticulousness having brought a profound injustice to light. Mr. Davies, the prosecutor, saw his career ascend, forever marked by the extraordinary case of the silent witness. Elodie, however, sought no fame or retribution. Her focus was on healing, on finding her place in a world that was both terrifying and exhilarating. She began to take long walks, exploring the bayou and fields she had only ever seen from her window. Feeling the sun on her skin, the damp earth beneath her feet. Each step was an act of reclamation, each breath a testament to her resilience. The reckoning for the Fontino was swift and severe. But for Elodie, the aftermath was a slow, arduous process of rediscovery, of learning to live and to speak in a world that had once denied her existence. Years passed. The memory of the Fontino trial, though still a dark chapter in St. Landry parish history, began to recede, replaced by new scandals and triumphs. Belrive, stripped of its former glory, eventually fell into disrepair, its grand columns crumbling, its gardens overgrown, a silent, decaying testament to the secrets it had once held. Armand and Odette Fontino died in obscurity, their names forever synonymous with their crimes. Genevieve, after years of quiet introspection, eventually found a measure of peace, dedicating her life to charitable works, perhaps as a silent penance for the sister she had unknowingly abandoned. Elodie, however, found her true voice, not just in words, but in purpose. She never fully regained the robust health of one who had lived a life free from confinement, and her quiet demeanor remained. But her mind, sharp and observant, thrived. She became an advocate for the vulnerable, working tirelessly with local charities to establish homes for neglected children and to provide education for those who, like her, had been denied access to the world. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, the profound impact of isolation and the transformative power of knowledge and human connection. Her own experiences, once a source of immense pain, became a wellspring of empathy and determination. She never married, choosing instead a life of quiet service and intellectual pursuit. Her small cottage, filled with books and the scent of jasmine, became a sanctuary for those seeking solace or guidance. She learned to paint, her canvases often depicting the vibrant, untamed beauty of the Louisiana bayou, the very landscape she had once only dreamed of. Her art, like her words, was a testament to a spirit that had refused to be extinguished, a voice that had refused to be silenced. The story of Elodie Fontino became a legend passed down through generations in St. Landry parish, a tale of a girl hidden from the world whose silence was broken by the very system designed to expose truth. It was a story that made people question the facades of respectability, the hidden cruelties that could fester beneath polished surfaces, and the enduring power of the human spirit to find its voice, even after decades of enforced quiet. What was lost to Elodie was an ordinary childhood, a lifetime of simple joys, and the easy familiarity of family. But what she found in the crucible of her suffering was an extraordinary strength, a profound understanding of humanity, and a voice that once heard could never again be forgotten. Her life, though marked by immense sorrow, ultimately became a beacon of resilience, a quiet testament to the triumph of truth over the deepest, darkest secrets.